Hello, welcome to Little Steps Facebook Live. Just a few friendly reminders before we get started with our topic. We are live twice a month, and if you wish to be reminded directly to your phone to our live sessions, go to our Facebook events page and click the ones that you're interested in. Don't forget to sign up to all our weekly newsletters across major cities in Asia, from Hong Kong to Singapore to KL and beyond. The link is in the description. Now we are live, so feel free to ask us any questions, give us comments, and interact with us right here, and we will get back to you during and after the live session. Let's get started with our topic, Raising Global Teens. Raising Global Teens is a book written by Dr. Anisha Abraham, and it is based on her experiences as the daughter of immigrants, taking care of teens globally, as well as living and working with her husband and 2 kids in Asia, Europe, and the US. Today, she's with us here live as we discuss important topics such as identity, sex, social media, body image, puberty, drugs, and stress. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Anisha Abraham, who is a pediatrician, teen health specialist, and author. She's currently on faculty at Georgetown University Hospital and has previously worked at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her book, Raising Global Teens, was published last October and has been a bestseller on Amazon in several categories. You can find her book at Bookazine across all their branches in Hong Kong, except the one in Times Square. And we're also doing a lovely giveaway with Bookazine today. 3 lucky winners will be receiving her book today if they comment or ask us any questions during our live session. And the 3 lucky winners will be announced at the end of the session. Looking forward to it. So welcome, Dr. Abraham. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks
Good.
for having me.
Yes, we're so happy to have you. Where are you right now, if I can ask?
I'm currently in Washington, D.C.
Oh, cool. How is it cold? Must be quite chilly.
Definitely colder than Hong Kong.
I can imagine. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a pediatrician and a teen health specialist, and I'm also the daughter of South Asian immigrants. Grew up in the United States. Actually, when I was growing up as a teenager, I was the first Indian American to graduate from my high school. It was a time when you saw other Indians, you would literally stop your car to say hello to others. And I have 2 boys, and we've lived in Europe, Asia, and United States. And I wrote this book very much based on my experiences as being a teenager and having that cross-cultural upbringing, also as being a pediatrician, taking care of young people in many different settings, and certainly as a parent, also dealing with 2 boys and all of the excitement of living in different countries. And I'm certainly hoping that other parents can share from some of these experiences.
No, absolutely. I was very, very interested in your book, also coming from a global teen myself. My parents are multicultural. So no, I was very fascinated about the book. May I ask you, how old are your boys?
My boys are 10 and 12.
Ooh, exciting ages. About to go into teen mode as well.
Yes, and they're testing me all the time. So yes.
I can imagine, especially with traveling so much. So you said that you were living in Hong Kong, as we are in Hong Kong. How long did you live here, and what's your favorite place here in Hong Kong?
Yes, so I lived in Hong Kong for 5 years, and then I lived in Amsterdam, Netherlands for 5 years, and we've just moved back to Washington, D.C. about 3 months ago. So I certainly have been moving around quite a bit, and I have lots and lots of favorite places. I think Hong Kong is forever in my heart. Yeah. And while I was there, I was a big runner, so Bowen Road was one of my favorite places to run. Yes. But I'm particularly partial to just getting out to the water. And I know you're in Checo right now, and I have to say it's one of my favorite beaches. But I'm very happy in any place in Hong Kong, actually.
Absolutely. No, it's a beautiful city. It's one of those unique cities that has a lot to offer, from beaches to city life to hiking. So I do very much love this city. So let's get started with our topic. As usual, we'll be splitting up today's chat into 3 areas of focus. First, we'll be focusing on her book, of course, Raising Global Teens. Secondly, we'll be talking about how to communicate with your teen. And thirdly, lastly, we'll be talking about teens during a global pandemic. So let's discuss your book. So can you tell us, what is a global teen?
Well, a global teen is really another word for a cross-cultural teen, and that's really an umbrella term for a lot of young people right now. So certainly if you've had a parent that was an immigrant, as my parents were, from India to the United States, if you're an immigrant yourself, If you have moved from community to community in one country, much less a country to another, as many expats do when they come to Hong Kong. If you have parents from two different backgrounds, my husband is German, I'm Indian American, so we have very different backgrounds, but certainly many kids have parents that have different cultural or religious backgrounds. So these would all be young people that would be considered cross-cultural. But more and more, we also have young people that are exposed to more than one culture in their daily life, simply from their own school experiences or what's happening in the world around them, not only physically, but also virtually. So really the premise of my book is that more and more young people are what we now consider cross-cultural kids, and have this interaction again with more than one culture in their daily life. And there's some wonderful things that come with it, and also some challenges.
Yeah, I can imagine in 20, 30 years from now, most teens will be global teens, especially with how we are virtually. Schools were interacting more and more with people from different cultures. So absolutely. Now, what inspired you to write this book? Was it being a pediatrician? Was it being a teen health specialist, or a daughter of immigrants, or combining all those together?
I really think it was combining all of those experiences. Certainly, when I was growing up, no one really talked about these issues. And in fact, it wasn't until I went off to university that I actually really felt that there were other Indian Americans that had had that same experience, and I could actually connect with them and say, well, this may be my tribe. So we didn't really talk about it. And certainly in my experiences with working with young people, in various settings. I was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and I was a military doctor,
Wow.
and even community. Also, young people were moving, from place to place and have had similar experiences, but no one was really talking about these issues. And certainly, as an expat myself, I felt a profound sense of loss and grief every time I moved from place to place, and I couldn't really quite put my finger on it because no one had really talked to me about these issues very specifically. So I think it was all of those experiences that really came together to help write this book. And I'll just mention that in writing this book, I actually did a survey of young people and parents, about 300 around the world. And one of the things I can say is that about 70% of them never really talked to their own parents about issues related to identity and belonging and change and transition. So I think this is really important as what we need to be doing.
Did you discuss this afterwards with your parents?
Well, I think they certainly have read the book, and
Yeah.
I that they certainly are aware of the fact that these were things that we just didn't talk about at that time. And of course, we've had some really beautiful discussions since then. But I really feel like in many places, people just assumed that kids would be okay because you were doing the right thing at the time and you didn't know anything differently. And I think, again, a lot of what we talk about in this book is how we can be more aware of young people with cross-cultural experience and how best to support them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So how do we address identity and belonging with global teens?
Well, as I mentioned, a lot of young people say that they haven't really talked about this issue specifically, but they do sometimes really have a sense of not knowing who is their tribe, who do they belong to, who do they connect with. So I think the first step, of course, is talking to young people. I talk a lot about the importance of telling your personal story. And I mentioned, for example, that my own father was an immigrant from South India to the United States. He actually came on a Spanish cargo ship in the 60s and had this incredible story of coming to the United States. My mother, had an arranged marriage and grew up in Kuwait and then came to the United States. My father-in-law lived during World War II and had this terrible trauma of, living through a country that kind of had that impact. So everyone has their personal story.
Yes.
And so sharing those stories with kids and allowing kids to talk about it is one piece of identity and belonging. I think the other is, of course, creating roots and connections with the community that you're part of and ensuring young people can do things, whether it's extracurricular activities or traveling or learning about the community that they're part of, but also holding on to traditions. I know in our own family, it's almost Christmas time. All the German, candles and lights and figurines are coming out, in our house. And so upholding all of these different, parts of our heritage are really important for kids. Language is a really important part of that. I think in Hong Kong, we do a pretty good job of ensuring that kids have exposure to more than one language.
Yes.
making sure that's two-way. I know when I grew up, it was really encouraged that people learn English. So my parents spoke to me in my native language of Malayalam, but I wasn't encouraged to speak back in Malayalam. So I understand it perfectly, but I don't speak it as well because they just assumed, well, she'll learn it at some point. So making sure that language is two-way and you're not just hearing it, but you're also speaking back. It's another part of identity and belonging. So I think these are just important things to be thinking about as we talk about young people today.
That's very true. As my mother, she's also a daughter of immigrants who moved to Holland, and her parents neglected to speak Bahasa to her, so she only understands a few words, but doesn't really understand. She understands the language, but can't speak it back. So, and she really misses that part of her culture. I think it's very important, as you said, to speak about it. What do you think is a good time and age to talk about these things, though? To start thinking about identity and belonging with your children?
Well, I don't think there's any time that's too early to start. Okay. And I may say this is a common theme for any of these issues, yes. Whether it's talking about changes in your bodies or sexual health or any of these other things. It's never too early to start. Of course, you want to make it developmentally appropriate, and talking to your 6-year-old is very different than talking to your 16-year-old. But I think, starting to have those conversations is really important.
Good, thank you. Now, what do you want parents to take away after reading your book, Raising Global Teens?
Well, I think probably the most important thing for me is the importance of having conversations with kids, because conversations create connections, and connections are so important right now for young people, particularly in this time of a COVID pandemic and uncertainty and challenge. Mm-hmm. So coming back to those conversations are really key. One of the chapters of my book actually start with questions that young people have asked me over the years, and also questions that parents have asked me. And I tell parents that are busy, if you have nothing else, just skip to the end of the chapter, because those are some of the answers. And so just being able to kind of use that as maybe a sounding board for some of the questions that young people are asking, and having conversations are really helpful.
Yes, thank you. So for those of you who just joined our Facebook Live, we are here today with Dr. Abraham discussing her book, Raising Global Teens. We've just discussed the first bit or topic of our session, which is her book. And now we're going to our second topic, which is how to communicate with your teen. Very hot topic, I can imagine. So how to communicate with your teen. How do I create a relationship with my teen where they feel safe to confide in me?
That's a really good question. And I think the short answer is making sure that you have, you create that space, you create a relationship where they feel like they can come back to you. And we'll be talking more about how do you start to talk to teenagers so that they will actually open up and share things with you. I do think that creating routines and traditions are one way of that. So family meal times, for example, are a wonderful time for people to sit together and to make sure that they have those connections and that time to be able to create that safe space where kids feel open and can share things. So, creating rituals, creating times, creating moments where young people can share with their parents is just one piece of creating that safe place. I think also creating trust and respect, making sure that you're listening to your child. So many times we're so busy talking to our kids that we're not really hearing what they have to say, is another piece of creating that environment where young people feel safe and feel that they can actually share and talk about what's going on in their lives.
Yes, of course. That's very difficult for teens, and to feel safe. And the older you get, the more embarrassing your parents become and the less you want to discuss. So yeah, that's very good tips. Just a friendly reminder to our viewers, we are giving away her book today, Raising Global Teens. So if you interact with us, ask us any questions right here. We'll be giving away 3 of her books to 3 lucky winners. So feel free to interact with us right now, right here, and we'll be coming back to you during this session. So going back to how to communicate with your teen. Can you give us 3 key tips on how to communicate effectively with our teens? We've discussed how to create a safe space and how to listen to our children, but I think that a lot of parents find it hard to communicate with their teens. So I'm just trying to get your insight here.
It's not easy, and it's certainly a question that parents ask quite often. And again, part of adolescence is pulling away and creating your own individual identity. You're thinking about your physical identity, your sexual identity, your cultural identity, and kind of, again, starting to do that on your own and not perhaps always want to spend time with parents. So it can be hard sometimes to create those connections and have that communication. Coming back to 3 tips, my first tip would be that if you can talk about what young people's friends are doing, it's a great way to talk about what's happening in their lives.
What
So
a great
instead of
idea.
saying, which not every young person wants to talk about, have you
Mhm.
had friends that are vaping or smoking? Can you tell
Yeah.
me a little bit more about who's in school that's doing this? And they can certainly tell you about what's happening there. But if their friends are doing it, it's more likely that they also either are receiving pressure to do it, or they
Mhm.
themselves may be involved in those behaviors. And so it's something that, again, can help that discussion. So ask what their friends are doing as a way to break the ice, to talk about what's going on in their lives. That would be my first tip. The
Okay.
second is that it can be really hard when you're looking directly in your child's eyes and asking them a topic. If you remember your own parents and their activities looking at you, it can be really intimidating. So my other thought is to try to do activities in parallel when you're having these difficult conversations. So whether it's walking with them or driving them, or being in a taxi with them, or doing something where, again, you're not directly looking them in the eyes. And my own boys, it's late at night when it's dark in their rooms and I've turned off the lights and they're kind of sleepy. And then I ask them questions because they
What
can't
a
quite
good
see me.
idea.
So, that's another thought. So think
Yeah.
about to do this while you're doing something in parallel. And then my
Mhm.
third tip, and I'm certainly guilty of this as a parent, is what I call the 50% rule. And sometimes we forget that teens' brains are not fully developed until sometime in the early 20s. They may look, again, fully physically developed, but their brains are not developed until sometime in their 20s. And so even though we have these wonderful, logical, very thoughtful arguments that we continue to keep going on about, they sometimes aren't able to process all of that. So coming back to the 50% rule, try to say half of what you have to say, because keeping it short, keeping it simple is probably a much more effective way of communicating and ensuring your child hears what you're trying to communicate.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Those are wonderful tips. We've got a question coming in from, I hope I'm saying this right, Marsha Ferrand. Do global teens have particular mental health issues or challenges? Is her question.
That's a great question, and I know we brought up the fact that global teams have both strengths and they also have challenges. So I'll
Mhm.
start with challenges first, and then I'll come back to the strengths
Of
because I
course.
think
Yeah.
there's both. And I will just say that the challenges include, particularly if you're moving from place to place, certainly as my own kids have recently, there can be a
Mhm.
tremendous sense of grief and loss, that you're losing friendships, you're losing family, you're losing things that you know. And sometimes it's hard to know, unless we ask very specifically, that they're having that grief. I can say even as an adult, having moved, it took me a year or two after moving from each country to really let go of the last place and to start to take on the new place. So grief and loss is one. Certainly, there's been some thought that adolescence is more prolonged in kids
Mhm.
that have multiple exposures, partly because they're not seeing the same mirrors and anchors that you would see if there was a monoculture and everyone else was exactly the same, if that makes sense. And so there's some thought that, again, it takes a little bit longer to process all of the things that they're supposed to do because the inputs are just a little bit different.
Mhm.
When you have ways, for example, drinking or any of these other teen-like behaviors.
Yeah.
So other piece that I did mention earlier is, again, this issue related to identity and belonging. That can be a big issue for young people, not quite knowing who they actually fit in with. And some kids do great, but other ones have challenges. Now, coming to the strengths, I would say they include things like adaptability and a worldview and tolerance. And these are all wonderful skill sets to have right now in this world. The world really needs young people like this. And we've mentioned a little bit about language as well, this ability to sometimes have more than one language, sometimes several. You grew up in the Netherlands, and I can certainly say from my time there, I was amazed how the Dutch were able to go from one language to the other very easily. And this starts a lot of times quite early. So those are
Mm.
some of the beautiful strengths that come along with being a cross-cultural kid.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Marsha. I hope that answered your questions. We've got a few more questions coming in. I love this. Great. We've got one from Petra Sander. Again, sorry if I mispronounced her name. Would you have any tips on how to motivate pandemic fatigue teens? Oh, she stole my question. But yes. Absolutely. Great question, Petra. Thank you.
Yeah, it's tough. And Petra, I really understand. I feel your pain. I have two boys that have been online at home here in Washington, D.C., and I think they're just done. And certainly we as parents are done. We're so ready for them to go back to school. I know schools in Hong Kong are closing down again. It's been this kind of back and forth in many parts of the world. And I think my short answer is stick to routines, because routines and creating structure are really helpful for kids. So making sure you stick to the wake up times if you can for your younger kids, sticking to meal times, all of those routines, encouraging them to have some non-digital exercise time is really important. Certainly realizing that all of our kids are uneven. They're going to excel in some areas and they're going to struggle in others. So building on those strengths, what they do well. I have one son that loves technology. So he's created his own YouTube channel where he uploads his own videos that he narrates. And that for him has been has been very empowering. So build on whatever unique strength your child has as another way to handle pandemic challenges. I will also say that this is a time probably to decrease our expectations just a little bit in terms of screen time, in terms of performance. And I know that's hard because we really want to make sure our kids do well and their grades, are going to be okay and they are continuing to play their instruments and do all of their sports. But this is a really challenging time to do all of this. Doing this virtually is very different than doing this face to face. And just remember that kids around the world are going through the same experience. This may be a time just to decrease our expectations just a tiny bit. And I think my final thought is that this is a wonderful time to build on resilience. And I talk a lot about this concept of having bounce, which is the ability to get back on your feet when you've experienced challenge, when you've experienced uncertainty, the loss of milestones that many of our kids are experiencing right now. And so allowing kids to perhaps experience some of these challenges, not to move away all of those challenges so that they themselves can start to problem solve is a wonderful ability, and probably the biggest predictor of success, again, is resilience and being able to get back after facing a challenge like the COVID pandemic.
Fantastic. Thank you. Got another question come in. Hilsu Wong. Thank you. What's your advice on the best approach if your teen is vaping?
Okay. Well, to begin with, if you truly want to know if they're vaping and they haven't told you yourself, go back to my earlier tip, which is talk about their friends and what their friends are doing. Vaping is a tricky one because a lot of young people are vaping and they tell me that they think it's bad to smoke cigarettes, because I think the cigarette industry has done a very good job in telling them that it's not good to smoke cigarettes, but they don't think it's such a bad thing to vape. They think it's probably less of an issue. So there is a bit of a disconnect there. A lot of what I talk about has to do with the fact that teen brains are developing, and particularly when you're going through this time of development, if you start any behaviors like smoking cigarettes or vaping or even drinking alcohol early on, it's much harder for you to stop. And in fact, can become addicted a lot earlier. So a lot of what I tell young people is, can we just delay this just a little bit longer? Because it's much easier when you're older to be able to start this as opposed to when you're younger, as one piece of it. But the other thing is, if there's a family history of anyone that's been smoking or having a hard time smoking, you're more likely to not be able to stop as well. So there's little things to think about. But the thing that probably helps the most is talking to young people about the fact that in many cases, companies are targeting them by making vaping alluring, by making it inexpensive, by putting ingredients in there that are targeted to children, because they know that if they can get a kid at 13 or 14 or 15 to start vaping, they have someone that can vape lifelong. So telling them that they themselves are being manipulated sometimes gets them really annoyed. But I would come back to the point of, how do we keep our bodies healthy? How do we keep our brains healthy? How do we ensure that we don't start these behaviors just yet? And how do we handle the pressure that we're getting from our friends to sometimes do this? and are there some better alternatives? So those are some quick tips, but start by talking about it, asking what friends are doing, asking why they're doing it. If this is because they're bored, is there other alternatives? And if you're really struggling, this is a great time to talk to a health provider. A lot of them are now doing consults by telemedicine to ensure that things change early on.
Very good. Thank you. We've got more questions coming in. This is great. I love the interaction. We've got a question from Anna Mastrangelo. Again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. The question is, if your teens are not sticking with the family rules, what do we do? Do we take away the devices if they are not sticking with the time limit? But if they use schoolwork as excuses, how should we respond?
So if I am understanding Anna's question correctly, it's really related to screens and devices.
I think so, yes.
Which I think is something that a lot of families are struggling with right now. And it's not easy because it all kind of blurs together. They're on it for school and then they're on it for pleasure, and it's really hard to know. Again, I truly believe that creating boundaries and creating structure is important. As Anna probably pointed out, it's hard sometimes to know, and I don't know how old Anna's kids are, but certainly as kids become older, it's even more difficult to sometimes tease things out. Yes. I'm a firm believer in coming and using contracts. Common Sense Media, for example, is a wonderful resource, and they have media contracts. So if you're really struggling with a child that just is not getting off devices, that may be something to go to, and it kind of spells out where a child and a parent can write down some guidelines and some ideas about what happens in terms of hours and also what the consequences are. Mm-hmm. And I my parents, at the end of the day, you are probably paying for your child's phone or device. And so you do have the ability sometimes to say, we need to take it out of the room at nighttime. We need to disconnect it, or we need to stop this completely. So you do have that ability. My final tip when it comes to screen time, by the way, is what I call the 3 C's. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a good way to know how much is too much screen time, because in general, a lot of kids are using screens. And the first C has to do with context. The second C is about community. And the third is the child. So know the context of what your child is doing on the computer. A lot of our kids are using it for educational purposes, and I think that's okay. A lot of them are also using it to communicate with friends, and it's a really important way for them to stay connected. So my threshold for stopping screen use has decreased a bit, because I know sometimes my kids are using it because they're connecting with their friends. So be aware of that. So know what they're using it for. The second is know your own child. If you have a child that has a hard time stopping their media use and has a hard time with impulse control and all those things, then that may be someone that needs a lot more contracts and boundaries in place. And then the final thing is, we no longer call it internet addiction, but we call it problematic interactive media use. So if your child is lying about it, waking up in the middle of the night, constantly needing it, is not talking to friends or family members, that is when you need to get additional help and really kind of jump in there. But otherwise, I think we need to realize that we have to relax just a little bit more when it comes to screen time.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for all your questions. We'll get back to our topic, but keep coming in with your questions. We'll be answering them live. And even after our session has ended, we can still answer your questions. So keep bringing them in. Moving on to my section. When is a good age to discuss gender identity, sexual preference, how to stay safe both mentally and physically when becoming sexually active?
Well, I think the short answer is the earlier you can start these discussions, the better you do. And I'm going to just mention a very short experience that I had that I also talk about in my chapter on sexual health, which is when I first moved to the Netherlands. We went to a children's museum called the Nemo, and you may be familiar with the Nemo Science Museum. But the top floor of the Nemo at the time had an entire exhibit, and it was all about the adolescent. And I said, oh, this is wonderful. I work with teenagers. This is great. And I was amazed when I started dealing with puberty and changes in the body. And then there was a whole thing about the French kiss and the physiology of the French kiss. And it actually had, tongues, and you can put your fingers in there. I'm like, wow, this is interesting. And then I realized right beyond that were mannequins in sexual positions and contraception. I'm like, this is a children's science museum. I'm really shocked. And then I realized, as the longer I lived in the Netherlands, this is really part of the Dutch way of being open about communicating about sexual health. And in fact, because they're so open, the data is so wonderful when it comes to sexual health in the Netherlands. They have very low teen pregnancy rates. Young people report that they've had a positive encounter when they finally do have a sexual encounter, which is not the case in many places. There's very high use of contraception, and there's a very good sense of consent and all the other things that we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I will just come back to what I think the Dutch are doing well, and probably come back to your question, which is we should start early, and sexual education starts in Netherlands by the time kids are 4 or 5. Again, we start slow and we start to ramp up. So by the time kids are 10 or 11, we're talking more about gender identity. By the time that they're 15 or 16, we're talking a lot more about the ideas of relationships being something that's positive, that they should always have the power to say no, that there are responsibilities and consequences that come along with it. So these conversations are kind of graded. I talk about the metaphor of the fact that it's you don't make everything at one time, but these are layers. It's a layered approach, like a lasagna. So to answer your question, start early. If you don't feel comfortable, then you can outsource it to friends, mentors, to another doctor, someone else that can talk about it. But it's so important to have these discussions.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Would you suggest in getting, because as you went to the museum, would suggest getting props, maybe books, things, so that it maybe feel easier to discuss such things? Do you feel that going to the museum and seeing it all out there was an easier way to interact with your children and discussing what you saw? Or would you think this is more a conversation that doesn't need props?
I think it really depends on the parent. And most young people, especially during my time in Hong Kong, that they didn't talk about sexual health with their parents. And if they did, it was really awkward. And one of my favorite stories is of a young girl that told me that her mom said that she wasn't allowed to become sexually active until she got into a good university. So there's all of these things that, young people are being told. And in many ways, it's really awkward. So I think that if you don't feel comfortable having these conversations, then certainly, use books, use other ways to start those conversations. I'd love to say that even, using my book, questions, some parents have told me that the book has moved around in their house because they are assuming that their teenager is now reading it as a way to kind of think about some of these issues. So whatever you need to be able to have those conversations, I think are important. And like I said, if you don't feel like you can do this, get a mentor, a coach, a trusted family member, or get your physician to be involved to start having these discussions.
So you're definitely saying, do not feel embarrassed, because I imagine a lot of parents do feel embarrassed to discuss such topics. And as you said, maybe feel unable to do so because their parents never talked about it, and this went on and on. So there is no shame in seeking help elsewhere and having those discussions with other people rather than yourself with the child, which is great.
I mean, I think at some level, if you as a parent could start to inform yourself to be comfortable to have it, it's always better. But certainly realizing that you can tap on others' expertise. But at the end of the day, if you don't have these conversations and you're assuming school is going to be doing this training, you may not get a lot out of it. Most young people tell me that they get their information from their friends or from the internet. And I'd much rather have my child come to me if they had a question or if they had a concern, particularly when it relates to sexual health, than to go to these other sources. So that's the importance of feeling comfortable and getting others to help you out.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got another question coming in from Niha Malik. What is the best way to be a cool parent? Participate in activities that your teen enjoys with friends, or stay clear of their space? Perhaps it's a balance?
That's a great question. I haven't been asked.
Great question. I love it. Yes.
And I like you're really thinking about how best to kind of navigate all of this. And I think the short answer is that it depends on your child and your interaction with your child. But I would probably say creating some kind of a balance where you have your own time to do things as a parent with your child apart from their friends, things that might be particularly kind of unique, whether it's, going for a run or going hiking or, doing something that they like to do with you, cooking. Those sometimes are those wonderful rituals that they can come back to. And sometimes it's also fun for them to see you, with their friend group. But remember, as kids get older and adolescents, sometimes they only want to be with their friends. They don't want their parents involved. So respecting that and not inserting yourself is also important. So I say the short answer is there is a balance. And again, as kids get older, sometimes they, don't want that involvement at the same level.
Perfect, thank you. We have another question come in, again, I think from Marcia Ferrand. The question is, have you noticed that it is harder for global teens to find mentors or people to confide in, look up to, as they are far away from family or longtime family friends?
I think that certainly if kids are moving from community to community, it can sometimes be harder for them to have those mentors or those connections. But I also think this is the importance of creating this support and this structure and reaching out. And again, because so much of what we do now is virtual, it's really easy to now get back on a Zoom call or through the phone or email to continue to hold on to those relationships. So I think that trying to continue to build on those rapport in all the ways that we can tap into technology is important. I'll just use one example, which is when I was moving, it was really tough for one of my sons in particular. He really missed our life in the Netherlands and was really having a tough time. And I reached out to my mom and I said, you just need to keep talking to him. And so they had these regular chats, by FaceTime and whatever else. And that actually really helped him. And sometimes kids don't want to always hear us as parents, but they will listen to somebody else. And in this case, his grandmother really was this wonderful source of love and patience and kindness that really got him through a tough time. So being able to hold on to those connections are important. But coming back to Marcia's question, it can be tough because as opposed to kids that don't leave or don't move or stayed in the same community, are sometimes cross-cultural kids have more of those transitions and changes. So being able to hold on to things and really build on those relationships are much more important to do.
Absolutely. I remember of the few times that I'd moved around, I had a little project with a friend of mine because I moved to a different country, and then we did a coloring project where I would color in books and then we would send it to each other, and it really felt like a little piece of home. So I think keeping connections and keeping projects the same as what you did with your mother, I think it's very important for children when moving around, because it can get very lonely and strange for kids and they're not really sure why we're moving, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a very strange moment. We haven't received any more questions, but thank you all for your questions. To finalize the how to communicate with your teen, my last question is how to safely discuss body image and how social media could negatively affect the body image. Kids today are more and more on social media, and for people who have seen the documentaries, suicide rate is up due to bad body image with Instagram, social media, Facebook. So I'm wondering, how do we protect our children in keeping it safe and making them understand that social media is not reality?
Well, I think that media in general has certain benefits, and I talk about this quite a bit in my media chapter, which is, again, it's a really wonderful way for kids to communicate, to stay in touch, particularly with lockdowns and school being online and all of that. And certainly there's educational benefits as well. And social media in particular can have its benefits for those reasons. But for some people, it can also be a challenge, and it can also put them at increased risk for comparing themselves to others, particularly if they're constantly checking their likes and constantly comparing, what they see in their own feeds compared to what their friends are doing. So there can be this sense of comparison. And what we do know is if kids are constantly checking and they're really concerned about their appearance and so on, and they're on social media, that there's a much higher incidence of issues related to body image and eating disorders. So that is everyone, but there is some young people that are probably at increased risk. So I think it's important to be aware of that. One of the questions that I ask young people all the time when I'm with them in a clinical setting is, when you look at yourself in the mirror, are you happy with this? And is there anything you want to change? And I can't begin to tell you how many times I have kids that say, Dr. Abraham, I have a big nose, but everyone else has a big nose in my family, so it's okay. But then I have some kids that will tell me, I think I'm really ugly, or I'm really fat, or I really just hate how I look. And so I say, it's okay to have a bad hair day every once in a while and not, be happy with your appearance. But if you're constantly feeling this, then you probably are struggling with some issues related to body image. Yeah. And it's so important, because these issues start early, to be able to change that and to make sure that kids feel good about themselves by building self-esteem and take the emphasis from what's on the outside to what's on the inside. So I think my point is that social media can certainly play into this. It isn't the only reason that kids don't feel good about themselves. Certainly also messages that they get from their peers, from their friends, from their parents, sometimes can also affect young people. So, there's many different factors that play into it, but parents being aware of how kids feel about their bodies is really important. Certainly asking also questions in terms of this. And if for any reason you suspect that your child doesn't feel good or is doing things like restricting, or binging or hyper exercising, any of these other behaviors, it's a really important time to get additional help before things get a lot worse.
Understood. Thank you. We've got more questions coming in. This is great. We've got one from Aruni John. Dr. Abraham, as our lines between screen use for downtime, academics, even exercise increasingly blur, how do we redefine these various zones for our kids? Similar to what we've been asked before, but still a very good question. Thank you, Aruni John.
Thank you, Aruni. So the question again is, how do we redefine the lines between screen time and maybe non-screen time? Is that?
I think so, yeah. Or maybe differentiating the zones, since kids are using their screen time for school, for exercise, for communicating with it. How do we really separate those different zones and make sure that the kid or the teens are using them properly, I think is the question.
Oh gosh, that is not an easy question, Irene, because I think the short answer is that many kids are kind of toggling back and forth. You think about it, I mean, a lot of times they're on online school, but sometimes they're also, switching to something that might be for entertainment. They also might be on their phones, they're WhatsApping and whatever else. So it's really hard to get kids to just be able to do one thing at one time. I think if you're really concerned, certainly putting kids in open environments where you can check on them, maybe one piece of this, certainly kind of sticking to, some routines and structure and ensuring that they have non-digital time would probably be my other answer. And certainly in my own family, I kind of have a time where I say, okay, we need to get outside and get our exercise. We need to do our 1 hour of non-digital time. Take some breaks, get off all our devices, leave all our devices. Family meal times would be another really important time to ensure that we as adults put our devices away and we ensure that our kids put their devices away, so that we're all looking at each other and talking and having that. So I think the answer back is creating moments and times where we are taking breaks, ensuring kids are taking breaks is one way to preserve that. It's otherwise, I think, very hard to discriminate right now what they're doing what for. It's all very blurred. I think that's just the nature of what kids are doing these days. And also realizing that this is part of the future and certainly what we're going to see during a pandemic, and not being as alarmed as we would have been would be the other answer. So hopefully that helps.
I hope that answered your question. We've got one more from Carolyn Campbell. I'm seriously loving all this interaction. It's great. Her question is, teens now seem to question their gender identity more and earlier than we did in our generation. Gender identity and sexual orientations are separate issues. As parents, we are advised to support our gender questioning teen. Do we support their decision when it involves hormone injections and surgery, when we are not at all confident that is the right path? Oh, that's a very difficult. Where would you draw the line, if at all? I think that's a very, yeah, please, doctor.
Thank you for asking that question. I think that it's not an easy one to ask, but I do think that there are parents that are going through these experiences, and I will just say that um, many young people have some sense of their gender and sexual identity probably by the time that they're 9 or 10 years of age, although they may not act on it, and sometimes even earlier, they may not act on it till later in life. And certainly young people, particularly in Asia, have told me that there have been times where they don't feel open being able to express themselves because of stigma about family taboo, pressure from the community. So being aware of that and being open to kids being able to talk about these issues is really important. Certainly as a physician, I also think that there are some young people that may express that they feel that they don't have the gender that they potentially were assigned to. And so being aware of that and certainly supporting them, ensuring that they talk to a psychologist. I think that the person that was asking this question is referring to some of the hormones that we will sometimes prescribe as they're going through puberty, because we think it's easier to give it during that time than much later in adulthood, because it kind of arrests the development of those gender changes. I'm not here to tell you what the right answer is, but I will say that these are very important questions and decisions that probably need to be made with your team, with your physician, with your child, with a psychologist, to understand why this is important for your own teenager. And certainly if you're feeling uncomfortable with it, exploring that again with a professional would be really important. And in many communities, I truly understand that there is again barriers and stigma to this happening. And in some cases, I've even told families that maybe they need to go to a place where it's a little bit more welcoming for them, because there's so many barriers to being open in the community that they're in. So I'm not sure if I've answered that perfectly, except to say that at the end of the day, kids are coming to us as parents to support them. And I've certainly had teens that don't feel comfortable talking even to their parents about these issues and really struggle with issues related to mental health because they're not able to talk about these issues. So again, being able to talk to your own professional team about your concerns would be really important in this case.
Thank you. And thank you, Carolyn, for that question. Thank you. So we're moving on to our final section of today's chat. If you've just joined us, I'm here today with Dr. Anisha Abraham discussing her book, Raising Global Teens. Bookazine is also giving away 3 of her books. We'll be announcing the winner at the end. So keep asking us questions and you might be the winner of her book. So the final section will be discussing teens during a global pandemic. So that is teens worldwide at the moment. How do we help teens to cope with a global pandemic, uncertainty about the future, and loss of milestones?
Right. No, it's a really difficult time. And what I can say is that more and more young people are coming in and telling me that they feel stressed, depressed, anxious. We know that the incidence of anxiety among adults, at least here in the United States, has tripled, depression has quadrupled, and we're seeing very similar issues related to young people. So the pandemic is certainly increasing. Also, it's causing a surge also in mental health issues. And so I think it's very important to talk to young people coming back to conversations, talk to them about how they're feeling, how they're doing, validate their emotions, certainly ask very specifically about issues related to depression and suicide. Many parents tell me that they don't want to ask about suicide because they say that if they ask about it, they're more likely to get someone to act on it. And the short answer is, when you ask specifically about issues related to depression and suicide, you're more likely to get a young person that can tell you something and get them the support that they need. So I think that's an important message to hear when it comes to, again, the pandemic and mental health and how kids are coping right now. The final piece that I just want to bring up is that this is a very important time for us as adults to model what I call having self-help tools, taking out what it is that you use to handle stress. They always say when you're in a plane that as a parent, you put your oxygen mask on first before you put it on for your child. So this is an important time for us as adults to make sure that we're exercising, talking to our friends, doing yoga, mindfulness, journaling, whatever it takes to handle stress and challenge, but then ensuring that our kids are seeing that and that they're also building in some tools in their own toolkit so they can handle stress and challenge. So I think that's one piece of what we're seeing in terms of the pandemic. There's a lot more that I think we could also talk about, and I think I've talked a bit about strengths and routines and building resilience as the other piece of that. But the mental health piece is probably the most significant one that I worry about quite a bit as a physician right now.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Second question that I wanted to ask regarding teens during a global pandemic is, how do I help my teen to create connections during this isolated time? I think a lot of teens are at home doing the video, but they're not. I'm worried that they might not be creating the connections that they need in order to feel a part of this society, I guess. A lot of it is, we're all isolated a little bit at home.
Absolutely. And I have to say, my own family has felt this very intensely because we moved during the pandemic from one country to the other. And we started, my boy started online in a new school. And I hope it's not easy because when you start online, so we've really been in the situation of trying to, again, encourage them to create these connections. Again, regardless of whether you've moved from country to country during this time, even if you're in the same place, kids are not having those connections in the ways that they did. They're missing their extracurricular activities. They're missing seeing their friends and their family. I think that one thing that's been very helpful, and certainly my advice as a pediatrician, is to find what they do enjoy and coming back to those strengths and those passions. To build connections that way. One of my sons, for example, joined the debate team, and that has been for him something that has created a lot of connections and now friends, ways for him to kind of stay engaged and find other young people that have those same interests. One of my boys realized that he loves animals, and so he now has a job walking dogs every morning. You know, it's the power of having an animal has probably it's been the highlight almost of his day every day. Dog. And so I think it's important to realize every child is something that's going to get them through this and create those connections. But again, thinking about what their interests are, trying to align them, checking in with them, making sure that you're creating those connections by doing family events or family rituals are all ways to ensure that your kids are going to do okay.
Fantastic. Thank you. So already moving on to my last question of our session, and that is, how can you give us any tips? I guess you already have, but tips to keep our teens active during lockdown. I think we've discussed all of that in our previous questions, but if you do have any extra tips, let us know.
Wow. I think, we should be modeling this as parents. And so we can get out and stay active. If you're allowed to get out right now, that also helps set the stage for your own kids too. And if you can do things together, whether it's going for a hike or walking or any of the activities that you can do as a family, that probably encourages kids to get out. I also understand that sometimes that's hard to do. So, being creative with virtual activities, getting them to, dance as they're watching a movie or, doing, some kind of, stationary exercise or, whatever it is that you can do at home. There's also there's wonderful apps, that are out there right now to get kids to stay active and get parents to stay active if you're not to go outside. So certainly doing it with your own children, encouraging them to find something that they can do themselves are other ways to get kids to stay active. Maybe also having them reach out to a friend and to do something in parallel. If they can't see each other, but doing it at the same time may be another way just to make it fun. But it's not easy. I have to say it's tough, to do it right now. And I certainly, again, understand any family that's having a hard time getting their kids to be active. And we are seeing, by the way, the incidence of obesity has been increasing. So we need to be really aware of this and really be thinking about this. The pandemic not only is affecting kids emotionally, but also very much physically. So get kids out there, take those breaks if you can.
Fantastic. Doctor, I wish to thank you for our interview today. Thank you for checking in with us from Washington, all the way from Washington. Probably late at night right there, right now. Thank you, and thank you everyone for interacting with us today. Oh, we've got our lucky winners. So we've got 3 winners who will be receiving our book. Receiving your book, sorry. Marketing team will get in contact with you in order how to collect them. The winners today are Marcia Ferrand, Caroline Campbell, and Petra Sonder. Congratulations.
Yay.
Doctor, do you wish to add anything before we leave our chat? Have I missed any questions? Do you wish to add anything to our session before we head off?
No, I just want to thank you and Little Steps for hosting this today and getting this, wonderful discussion going, and for everyone that's been part of this and asking wonderful questions. I certainly encourage, again, parents, adults, educators to really take this time right now to, again, have those conversations and create those connections. I think they're so important. And again, I think my book may just help.
Yes.
That. So. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks to all our viewers. I think this will be one of our last Facebook Lives of this year, since the pandemic has hit us hard again in Hong Kong. So most of our Facebook Lives had to be rescheduled. For if this is our last time, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone out there, and have a good December and stay safe, everyone. Thank you, Doctor, once again, and good night for you, and good morning to the rest of us. Have a good day.
Take care.